Recorded Books presents an unabridged recording of The Elusive Mrs. Pollifax by Dorothy Gilman, narrated by Barbara Rosenblat. This book is copyrighted in 1971 by Dorothy Gilman. This recording is copyrighted 1990 by Recorded Books. If you make it across the border, get us help. We desperately need passports and identity papers. By the time Mrs. Pollifax got to see this message, this most unlikely of all international spies was already sporting a beautiful new hat. Perfect for hiding 8 forged passports. And now, The Elusive Mrs. Pollifax.
Chapter 1. A small group of friends had assembled in Mrs. Pollifax's living room on this warm July evening. There was Miss Hartshorn from apartment 4C across the hall, Professor Whitson from the botany department of the university, and various loyal members of the garden club, led by Mrs. Otis, the president. For the last hour, without the slightest embarrassment, they had continued to check both their wristwatches and the clock on Mrs. Pollifax's wall. It was 20 minutes before midnight. "Do you think now, Emily?" asked the president of the garden club anxiously. "Yes, is it time?" asked Miss Hartshorn. Mrs. Pollifax glanced at the professor for confirmation. He nodded. "Now or never, I should say." "Wonderful," breathed Mrs. Pollifax. "Lights out, then, everyone." Flashlight in hand, she led the group into the kitchen. The window was open to the sultry night, and the screen was already unlatched. Her flashlight played over the grillwork of the fire escape and came to rest on the box under the window. A reverent hush descended upon the group as they hung over Mrs. Pollifax's shoulder. "It's bloomed," said Professor Whitson in an awed voice. "I see it." "It's in bloom," called Mrs. Otis triumphantly over her shoulder to the others. "It's happened." "Turn on the lights and bring it inside," ordered Professor Whitson. "Gently now. Are my cameras in place?" Tenderly the window box was lifted to the sill, embraced and carried into the living room, where it was placed in the center of the rug. "There are 3!" cried Mrs. Pollifax, dropping to her knees beside a trio of delicate, spiky white flowers. "So that's a night-blooming cereus," whispered Miss Hartshorn. "They bloom just once a year, and then only for a few hours," said Professor Whitson, adjusting the tripod for his...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?